I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The topic I've been given to speak about today is Saudi Arabia as a partner in war and oppression. As much as I like talking about how bad the Saudi government is, and I think my co-speaker will deal with that at length, I'm going to focus entirely on the war in Yemen. This is for a few key reasons. Firstly, it has received very little attention and public attention and discussion. Secondly, the war there is totally catastrophic and could result in millions of deaths. Thirdly, the crisis could be ended overnight if the West withdrew its support for the war on Yemen. And this is quite important, Australia supports the war. We are complicit in a massacre that verges on the brink of genocide. So I thought I'd begin by setting out the context. The history of Yemen is too complex to explore at length in my talk, but I'll give a brief episode from the 60s that I think is quite illustrative. In 1962, there was a military coup against the feudal kingdom in North Yemen. A civil war broke out between the secular nationalist military rebels and the deposed Imam al-Badr. Western countries, Saudi Arabia and other reactionary regional powers backed the Imam. Egypt, then led by the progressive government of Gamal Abdel Nasser, backed the new military government. British historian Mark Curtis mined the British archives, and they're very revealing of Western foreign policy. The British Prime Minister's office observed that Nasser's side was able to capture most of the dynamic and modern forces, whilst we have been left, by our own choice, backing the forces which are not merely reactionary, but shifty, unreliable, and treacherous. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan admitted that it was repugnant to political equity and prudence alike that we should so often appear to be supporting out-of-date and despotic regimes and to be opposing the growth of modern and more democratic forms of government. The British government had no illusions about the deposed government they were supporting. They internally recognized that the imamate was unpopular with large elements, and those in many ways the best. It was much resented, an arbitrary autocracy. The British Foreign Secretary warned that the fall of North Yemen, if the new government secured itself, would threaten the stability of South Yemen. Particularly important in South Yemen was a military base at Aden, which Curtis describes as the cornerstone of British military policy in the Gulf region. If the British were forced out of Aden, it would be a devastating blow to our prestige and authority in the region and could cause a collapse in the morale of the pro-British rulers in the area, putting the whole British position into jeopardy. I'm going to skip ahead to more recent history. In 2011, people across the Arab world rose up against their dictators. In Yemen, the uprising was partially successful. Ali Abdullah Saleh was the president of Yemen from its reunification in 1990, and previously he ruled North Yemen from 1978. The uprising forced Saleh into exile in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government, in coordination with the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is rich Arab countries, imposed a transition plan for Yemen. The plan was also backed by the US. The Saudi GCC-US plan meant that Saleh would be immune to prosecution for corruption and abuses of power. Saleh stepped down, but he was replaced by his vice president, Abd Rabu Mansour Hadi. This was ratified by a presidential election in 2012, where Hadi was the only candidate. He won by the very impressive margin of 99.6% of the vote. So in the West, we call this a democratic transition. Stacey Philbrick Yadav and Sheila Karapiko, two academic specialists on Yemen, they explained that the Houthis and other dissidents opposed the GCC initiative, the democratic transition, arguing that it sought to demobilize the mass 2011 revolutionary uprising by sanctifying an elite pact between members of the Saleh regime and its formal multi-party, cross-ideological, loyal parliamentary opposition. This opposition was dominated by a conservative Northern Alliance. Among those excluded from the transitional coalition was the Houthis. The Houthis launched an insurgency in 2004 against the central government of Yemen. They're not formerly called the Houthis. That's what they're called because they follow different men from the Houthi family. They call themselves Ansar Allah. Before the present war, they were based in northwestern Yemen, and their following was among Zaydi Shia Yemenis. About a third of Yemenis believe in Zaydi Shia Islam, which is like, I think it's like fighters, and Iran is the more orthodox 12ers. Some have claimed that the Houthis are supported by Iran. However, there's little evidence of much beyond rhetorical support from Iran. A WikiLeaks cable from 2009 observed that most analysts report that the Houthis obtain their weapons from the Yemeni black market and even from the military itself. In July 2014, the government cut fuel subsidies, which caused wide countries in the Middle East. And it caused a lot of hardship and desperation. By September, the Houthis advanced on Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen. The Yemeni army, perhaps still loyal to Saleh, didn't intervene. By February 2015, President Hadi fled Sana'a to Aden in South Yemen, and as the Houthis advanced on South Yemen, Hadi fled to Saudi Arabia, like the previous dictator and so many other Arab dictators. It has been argued that the reason the Houthis were so successful in taking over the country was because they were backed by the former dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh, and in 2016, the Houthis and Saleh openly announced that they were allies. What I want to highlight about the war is this. There is a military base at Al-Anad in South Yemen. According to The Economist, Al-Anad is the biggest airbase in Yemen. On 21 March, the US was still evacuating military forces from that airbase. They've been using it to stage drone strikes against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. By March 25, the Houthis had taken the base. On that day, Hadi fled to Saudi Arabia, and the very next day, a coalition of countries led by Saudi Arabia began bombing Yemen, and of course, it was backed by the US. So now I just want to talk about how terrible the crisis in Yemen is. Before the war, Yemen imported about 90% of its food. At the start of the war, and this is well documented in a report by Human Rights Watch, Saudi Arabia imposed an aerial and naval blockade. Within 3 months, by June 2015, only 15% of pre-war imports were reaching Yemen. According to Human Rights Watch, the blockade meant that Yemen only received 20% of the country's minimum fuel needs. Fuel is needed to operate clean water pumps, so water and sanitation aid has reached only 3.3 million of the over 20 million Yemenis who lack access to clean water. By the 2nd of July, the UN designated Yemen to be at the highest level of humanitarian emergency, level 3, with an estimated 80% of the country's population in need of immediate human aid. There are over 25 million people in Yemen. That is, it took only 4 months for the war to mean utter disaster for Yemen, and it soon got worse. Saudi Arabia announced the closure of the port of Hodeidah on August 2. Hodeidah received more than 2/3 of all ship arrivals during the blockade. Port officials say about 70% of food imports and humanitarian aid came through the Hodeidah port. About 90% of World Food Programme aid traveled along the bridge from Hodeidah. On August 11 and 12, Saudi Arabia bombed that bridge. On August 18, they bombed the port. By December last year, the Saudi coalition had bombed Hodeidah 9 more times. The chairman of the board of the Red Sea port said that the port's infrastructure has been destroyed by the Saudi-led coalition. He also said that about 1/3 as much food went through Hodeidah in 2015 as they did in 2014. We don't know his estimate for 2016. So just remember, before the war, Yemen imported 90% of its food. It was never hard to predict the effects of blockading a country that almost entirely depends on imports to feed its population. In December last year, UNICEF said a child died every 10 minutes due to malnutrition, diarrhea, and respiratory tract infections. They found that more than 400,000 children are at risk of starvation in Yemen, with nearly 2.2 million in need of urgent care. The latest figures from the UN are that 17 million people in Yemen are severely food insecure, and 6.7 million people are in a state of emergency. On a 5-point classification system, they're just one step from famine. Save the Children, and again, these are all quotes. Save the Children says we're at the point of no return. If things are not done now, we may see that millions of children will have starved to death. On April 12, the UN issued yet another appeal, warning that millions are on the brink of famine. It warns that we are in a race against time to save lives and prevent a full-scale famine unfolding in the country. A World Food Programme representative warned that the situation is getting close to a breaking point in Yemen, with unprecedented levels of hunger and food insecurity. Millions of people can no longer survive without urgent food assistance. 6.7 million people require urgent food assistance. So this is not a crisis due to an earthquake or crop failure or hurricanes or anything like that. This is a crisis where millions of people could die due to a consciously chosen war policy. And that has all received crucial backing from the West. Without that support, the war would end overnight. So now I just want to talk about the Western backing for the war. So the Obama administration sold some $115 billion in arms to the Saudi government over the course of 8 years, and 42 separate arms deals. The UK has sold about $4.6 billion in arms in the 2 years since the war started. Yeah, indeed. New York Times reported that experts say the coalition would be grounded if Washington withheld its support. Western states have also been involved more directly in the war. So again, turning to Human Rights Watch, they identified the US as a party to the conflict. For example, a US Defense Department spokesman stated that the US was helping the coalition with intelligence support and intelligence sharing, targeting assistance, advisory support, and logistical support, to include aerial refueling with up to 2 tanker sorties a day. Furthermore, the commander of the US Air Force Central Command stated that the US military had a small detachment of personnel located in the Saudi Arabian center, planning airstrikes to help coordinate activities. This constitutes taking direct part in hostilities, and US participation in specific military operations, such as bombing raids, may make US forces jointly responsible for laws of war violations by coalition forces. Similarly, the UK Ministry of Defence said that the UK is providing technical support, precision-guided weapons, and exchanging information with the Saudi Arabian armed forces through pre-existing arrangements. Those weapons include 500-pound paveway for bombs used by Tornado and Typhoon jets. France is also providing jets, military transport aircraft, aerial refueling tanker aircraft, helicopters, amphibious assault ships, military patrol boats, light armored vehicles, and logistical support to some members of the coalition. Western countries have also offered crucial diplomatic support for the Saudi coalition. The UN Security Council has passed 2 resolutions on the war, which Yemen expert Karapico characterized as a cruel joke. For example, they recognize the government of Hadi as legitimate, they take no position on the invasion, and they impose sanctions, but only on the Houthi-Saleh alliance. It's important to stress the facts of Western support. All of these horrors could be ended with a phone call. If Western governments won't act, it is because there is not enough pressure on them to do so. In the UK, they actually came pretty close. A motion to stop British support for the war last year failed by a vote of 283 in favor of continuing support to 193 in favor of ending support for the Saudi war. That margin of 90 may sound big, but the only reason that the supporters of the war got over the line was because about 100 Labour MPs didn't show up or abstained from voting. So The Guardian reported on one Labour MP who opposes Jeremy Corbyn, but supported the motion. And he said he was angry because other Labour politicians were using this issue as a way of trying to beat Jeremy. So they supported the war on Yemen because of their squabbles with Jeremy Corbyn. Now, as heinous as that is, we haven't even gotten to that stage in Australia. And I'll turn to the Australian position now. So in Australia, our support for the war has not been as generous as that of the US and the UK, but it's kind of been bipartisan, and we have supported the war. So Foreign Minister Julie Bishop released a media statement 1 month after the Saudi invasion. Her statement identifies the invasion as a response to the request for protection from the exiled government of Abdu Rabu Mansur Hadi. Bishop recognized the Hadi government as legitimate. Remember the democratic transition that was so impressive to the West. Bishop went on to recognize the legitimate interests of Yemen's neighbors in maintaining regional security. So that was the extent of, her that's basically her position on the Saudi war. However, the government did take a firm position on what they regarded as the war criminals here. They imposed sanctions on the Houthi-Saleh alliance. So for over 2 years, Bishop, after her original statement, she maintained a complete silence on the war. She broke it on Sunday, April 24. That's at the start of the week. She announced an aid package of $10 million to help the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. She conceded that 7 million Yemenis are on the verge of starvation. For some reason, I have no idea why. She didn't identify why they might be starving or why they don't have food. Who could say? So she concluded her statement by saying, "We continue to urge all those involved in the conflict to return to negotiations towards a permanent solution to the conflict." So, you back the invasion and you say nothing about it or the blockade, but then, it's so sad that people are dying, so she throws like a tiny bit of money at it. Aside from diplomatic support for the war, Australian mercenaries are fighting in the war on the Saudi coalition side. So, for example, Mike Hindmarsh, who's a former Australian Major General, is reportedly leading the United Arab Emirates ground forces, and that's reportedly all of the ground forces are led by him because they're all commanded by the UAE. So he commands some 1,500 people. There's been some public debate of stripping citizenship of Australians who fight for jihadi groups in Syria and Iraq, and you've heard a lot about that. But there's been no moves at all to restrain mercenaries from Australia from fighting in the war on Yemen. And, we should bear in mind, Saudi Arabia cuts off people's heads too, but, they're the good head choppers, not like ISIS. They're the bad head choppers. So we don't have much information on our weapons exports to countries that have invaded Yemen. But what we do know is this. Australia approved 4 military exports to Saudi Arabia in 2016. In December last year, Minister for Defense Industry, Christopher Pyne, visited Saudi Arabia. And he went along with other business representatives like shipbuilding company Austal. They did so to promote more military exports to the Saudi government. They wanted to give more support to the war on Yemen. For some reason, Pyne refused to say which companies came on the visit, and he refused to say what material we have exported to Saudi Arabia. Seeking to further expand our support for the war, in February this year, Pyne visited Abu Dhabi to try to expand military exports to the United Arab Emirates. They're trying to reach an agreement on a $1 billion defense plan over the course of 10 years. He bragged about it to the media, as this would entail things such as high-speed support vessels and coastal protection and surveillance. On 29 March, the Greens successfully pushed a motion calling on the Defense Minister Maurice Payne to table Pyne's itinerary and any documents relating to our exports to the Saudi government. Amazingly, the motion actually received the support of the ALP and all of the crossbench. It appears that the government has ignored the motion, so they just refused to even respond. For some reason, it appears they're too embarrassed by their support for the Saudi war on Yemen to inform the public about our exports to the invading coalition. So this is despite an almost complete media blackout on the war. So, turning to the rest of Australia, there hasn't really been a campaign to end Australian involvement in the war in Yemen, but there have been stirrings of opposition. So Senator Scott Ludlam from the Greens kindly agreed to give me an interview for New Matilda, where he spoke out strongly against the war and urged an end to our military exports to Saudi Arabia. He condemned Australian support for the war in a public speech, which is in Hansard now, and he was the one who pushed the motion urging the government to disclose our military exports to the Saudis. In response to requests from me, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch released statements to me where they called on the Australian government to end military exports to Saudi Arabia. Human Rights Watch also wrote a letter to Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. They urged the government to stop sending arms to Saudi Arabia. This is in line with their overseas counterparts, which has also called on the UK and the US to stop arming the Saudi war on Yemen. Perhaps the weirdest part of this story is the position of the Australian branch of Oxfam, which I found pretty disappointing. So Australian Oxfam's position on the war, in my view, has been shameful. So British Oxfam, which has been good, led a campaign called Redline, where they urged people in the UK to write to the British government to prevent it from selling any more arms to Saudi Arabia. They said that selling those arms was not just immoral, but also illegal under international law. Australian Oxfam has refused to say anything like that. They have only expressed concern at our arms sales to Saudi Arabia. In a press release, they refused to even allocate blame for the blockade on Yemen. They just said a blockade had been imposed. So I emailed them and I asked, has any particular party been responsible for the blockade or for the famine? So Oxfam replied, and they conceded that the blockade has made a grave humanitarian situation even worse. However, they said there are a range of other factors which are all contributing to the massive hunger crisis in Yemen. So those factors include heavy fighting and the destruction of port facilities and infrastructure. Now, as I said, there isn't any mystery about who destroyed those port facilities and infrastructure. And if you want to find some documentation on that, you can consult media releases by Oxfam America. Oxfam America records the Saudi coalition bombing Hodeidah, and their media releases also blame airstrikes and the blockade for forcing Yemenis onto the brink of starvation. So I have no idea why they're so reluctant to criticize Saudi Arabia, but if you do belong to Oxfam and you want to take action, they will encourage you to write to the British government to urge them to stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia. Turning to the ALP, they've been about as terrible as you'd expect. So over the course of 2 years of the war, their foreign affairs spokespersons have been Tanya Plibersek and then Penny Wong. So both of them have said basically nothing about the war, and the exception under Plibersek was that she criticized Iran for supposedly backing the Houthis, and that's it. Wong herself has said absolutely nothing, but I got in touch with her, and I emailed her, and her media representative got back to me and sent me a statement. So it says the ALP is deeply concerned by the conflict. They condemn all violence and urge restraint from all parties, which means nothing. And they support negotiations based on the UN Security Council Resolution 2216, which basically backs the Saudi position, which is pro-Hadi, and takes no position on the invasion or the blockade. And the ALP, because they want to appear really humane, they call on both sides to restore peace. Yay. For those who would like the perfect symbolic representation of the ALP's foreign policy, there was recently a picture of when Mike Pence came to Australia, and Mike Pence is happily posing with Bill Shorten, Tanya Plibersek, and Penny Wong. And that's really all you need to know about our foreign policy. So, what are the prospects for change? Australia may not be in a position to itself end the war on Yemen overnight, but we can create pressure on the Saudi coalition. And we can also create pressure on other Western countries to stop supporting the war. So for a year and a half, there have been escalating warnings of catastrophe in Yemen. We're now on the verge of millions of people starving to death. It's gotten so bad even Julie Bishop has expressed concern. Whether or not there's change in Australian policy will depend on whether or not people start to act. The entire crossbench supported Senator Ludlam's motion. Now, given how delicately balanced the Senate is, any one of them could put a lot of pressure on the government on this issue. The fact that the government is too embarrassed to tell us about its arms sales to Saudi Arabia suggests they regard it as a political vulnerability. And well, they should. Australian policy on the war in Yemen is utterly indefensible. The only way they've gotten away with it has been the complete silence and indifference of the political class on the issue. No, it's not working. So the fault, friends and comrades, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. We have ignored the war in Yemen and is now threatening to turn genocidal. Through our silence, we've made ourselves complicit. Yemen is now on the precipice of a historic calamity. Whether Australian policy changes will ultimately be up to people like us. Thank you.